Our guest this morning, Don Watson, is an author of many best-selling books and award-winning books, including most recently The Bush, and shortly the kind of offshoot of The Bush, A Single Tree, which seems like the right order in which to do things. Good morning, Don.
Good morning, Michael.
And you, for Sense of Place today, you are taking us to the bush. You're talking about how the bush is personally significant to you. Would you call the dairy farm you grew up in the bush?
Well, we certainly wouldn't have. We would have called it the country. The condition was being on the land, and the bush was a regressive state, and we had no intention of going back to it. In fact, all our labours were directed towards getting rid of the bush. Most of the heavy work had been done by the time we took up this particular dairy farm, but there were still remnants of the old forest here and there, unmistakable remnants, really. And I guess there was this sense that that progress was sort of inevitable, and we were part of it. We were coming on a very slow and gentle wave, but towards something better than the bush, better than clearing it, getting rid of it. Only now, it's only in the last 30 or 40 years that Australians have started talking about the whole of the countryside as the bush. We would have taken it as a serious insult to be called bushies or something like this. I really didn't discover the bush itself except through stories, until I was in my 20s and I began camping in the bush, up in the ranges of Victoria.
Whereabouts? Where did you first go camping?
We used to go up around Big River, deep in there. I'd probably never find it now. There were places we went to. Up on the McAllister River, up beyond Maffra, up around Thredbo.
Did you just find your own way, or did you have friends who were more conversant in that part of the world?
Yeah, friends who were more conversant. When I was at ANU for a year, I used to go up to the Goodra-Digby and the Yerongabilly and those beautiful places. And there was one very memorable week or so we spent in the Barmah Forest on the Murray. And I guess what I sort of learned there was that, I had a vague idea of the vast differences from, one bush to another. The Murray was unlike anywhere else. There's something about an old river, It does something to you, hanging about by that all day, drinking beer.
Definitely does something to you. Dehydrates you like no one's business.
That's right. That's always stuck in my mind, the Barmah Forest. Really imprinted itself. A lot of tiger snakes up there.
How much is the experience when you're somewhere on the banks of the Murray or you're in the Barmah about being a settler Australian and about that question of feeling like you belong in a place or not?
That's a good question. I think after a while, I don't know whether you do it because you read and you learn something, but there is something about the aboriginality of places. Once you get a feel, even if it's largely, fallacious, a sense of people having walked here before, you never cross a gully on the highway, a Sheepwash Creek or something, without thinking how it would have been not so long ago. Certainly, a blink of an eye in real time. And you do begin to see sort of figures in the landscape, ghostly sorts of figures.
Mm.
That's really what you're doing when you learn anything about the Australian bush, I suppose, is trying to repopulate it. And I think, once you start to read it that way, it becomes one of the great pleasures to, if a melancholy one.
I was going to say the melancholy. I mean, you have that beautiful line in the bush where you talk about the way, I think it's the Murray you're talking about, the river never passes you twice, that there's a sense of the stuff that's moving on and ancientness, but also kind of inevitability or something.
Yeah, it reduces you. And that's probably what melancholy is in a way. And you sort of stay reduced ever after. But, I think there are sort of signs of that everywhere driving around the Australian countryside. You can be sort of feel a great tug at your heart just seeing an old fence or an old homestead that's crumbling down into ruin and being grown over by exotic plants that were put there by somebody who thought that this was going to be a little bit of Kent or Surrey.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, there are whole generations trying to stave off the bush or push it aside or have our cities and then our sprawling suburbs keep it at bay. And, I mean, you have some great Patrick White in A Single Tree. And, White, the way he wrote about the suburbs was as this thing protecting us from the bush.
Yes. Yes, and I mean, well, there is the sort of, the Freudian injunction, which is that we are, as human beings, our greatest enemy is nature, including our own, of course.
Yep.
And it's worth bearing in mind. We certainly lived that out, I think. Nature was to be conquered and kept at bay. And yet at the same time, I've always thought, it's very hard to break through the veneer which surrounds a lot of rural people, I think, of that sort of protection against melancholy. But the act of creation was also an act of destruction, just by its nature. The act of improvement was an act of destruction. And it was compulsory improvement. So there'd be these signs, the love of the wattle, the almost mandatory love of wattle that was inflicted on us. And more particularly birds, particularly for the women. The birds were their friends. In our family, there's a long line of women who were attracted to birds.
Because that's a safe part of nature, or that's something that you can engage with?
I think partly because it's safe, but I think probably also because they're almost transgressive, these creatures.
I can't stand a bird. They've got mean little eyes and pointy. And I'm not a bird fan. I know I'm going to alienate a lot of listeners with that. But
that could be the end of you.
I find them creepy. They're like I don't know.
They are sort of close to reptiles, of course. I think they were the vanished nature. They were the other side of the soul, in a way. They were like the ghosts of the past, and they came and lived in the rhododendrons and the fuchsias and hung around there, the species that survived. And they talk, and they have personalities, and I think they were the cure for loneliness of a very deep kind. Judith Wright, wrote wonderfully about birds. And a lot of people have secret attachments to them. Yeah,
it's a sign of an error of judgment, I would have thought. But one of the other things you write about when you write about the bush is the impatience to possess. Like that whole thing about progress and about development and change and all that horrible stuff is about wanting to own it, wanting to have these places. For you, you said you wouldn't necessarily find those places you went to camp again, but has the process of writing this book, of being in love with the bush, made you want to carve out bits that you possess, that you feel at home in?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, if I do, it's sort of been conquered by ideology, that I think it's a really bad idea that freehold of a part of the bush gives you absolute dominion over it. I think that, all land should be held at one level in common, that there's a sort of responsibility to it. So when I hear certain members of the National Party going on about how dare they not let us cut down these trees, I think, well, they're actually only partly your trees, and that's the way it should be. I'm in favour of environmental leases, but that's another story. And I suppose also that, if we had 147 acres, about a quarter of it near vertical. And all these years later, I left the farm when I was 18, that's 100 years ago, almost. But I know every little bit of it, every square foot of it I know. And I can recapture, and it haunts me in dreams and things. It's in the marrow now. And I don't know that I'm so pleased about that.
Really?
Well, it sort of gets in the way of the rest of your life.
Surely that's where the melancholy comes from, that streak.
Yeah,
no?
Probably. But I'd rather it wasn't there, in a sense. I'd rather, be free of it.
I like that the clogging up of your mind doesn't seem to have been an altogether bad thing, Don Watson. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Michael.
Don's latest book is A Single Tree, Voices from the Bush, and he is both haunted and fed by the bush himself. You're listening to Blueprint for Living.